This is a called City Council meeting, the agenda for which is listed this evening as a council workshop meeting. We have called and convened the meeting the evening of February the 2nd, 2023. We will move forward in terms of dispensing with some of our formalities from a council meeting, and then we will move to the subject of the Unified Development Ordinance. So with that, if you will, please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, and I will offer an invocation for council following that.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Lord, we are appreciative of the calling that you have placed upon our lives that brings us here this evening to consider the business of this city, and thank you for that calling that you've placed upon us. We ask tonight that we might be mindful as we head into a rainy and cold period to remember those that are out without proper shelter this evening, and for those that have no shelter this evening, as well as those who may be suffering from food insecurities or other things that propose challenges in their lives tonight, and ask that you'll be with us through this time together. We thank you for the effort and time that our staff and consultants have put into this. I hope that we'll be mindful as we go through that indeed this is a living document, and that we will work to make it work best for our community. We ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. So as Ms. Cotty joins us this evening, just in terms of agenda this evening, let me offer as we get started. I know you've probably got something that you want to help us with, and we are looking forward to that, and appreciate the time that you're going to give us this evening as well too. And we want to maximize that time with you both tonight as much as we possibly can. I realized about midweek that this is somewhat akin, without being sacrilegious, to rewriting the Bible. We can argue and talk about this for days and weeks on end. And, I have just about worn out my yellow pen with question marks and strikes and circles and all of those kinds of things. And, much like some of the prophets, there's things in here I don't understand or agree with, and just like Revelation, there's parts of it I don't get at all. So we will allow you as much time this evening as we possibly can. Council, as I mentioned this evening, while we need to move forward with the UDO and are making progress in that regard, and want to be respectful of your time as well too, while there may be questions and maybe in possibly a broad stroke that we can talk about, that's fine. I would ask some consideration of getting too deep in the weeds tonight. I think it would be most appropriate if we, as we go through this, if there is something that we want to make them aware of, certainly let's do that. If there is questions that are relatively easy to answer, I think that's a good one. If it's something that requires some discussion, we will engage in that, but I don't want to be overzealous in our efforts in that regard, because there's going to be time for us to continue to digest this and take it by staff and our consultants. And I know that there are several of us, maybe all of us, that are going to have very specific questions, which I hope we'll best have addressed by our staff in either individual meetings or smaller group meetings as we continue to move along. And so with that, I think it would be appropriate that we get started and turn it over to Ms. Cotty, and we'll go from there. How about that?
All right. Thank you, Mayor and Council. And I have some very short notes, and they honestly echo a lot of what the mayor just said. But first, I wanted to take the opportunity, because I don't think a lot of you have met our two new planners. So I did just want to point out Claire Byers and then Heather Stahl, our two new planners that joined us late last fall. And so they haven't come to council and given presentations yet, but we're really happy to have them on board. And honestly, they're a big reason of why we're here today, kind of restarting this project after a bit of a pause. And the next thing I wanted to do was thank you for your patience, as we did kind of put this project on a little bit of pause due to staff capacity. So thank you for bearing with us. And also thank you for your time tonight. I know work sessions, especially really in-depth conversations like tonight and the next several are going to be, are a lot of work, and we just really appreciate your time and your passion and your input into this. So with that, I just want to reiterate, as I did on the cover page, that this is a working draft. This is not we're rolling it out to the public, ready to go to public hearing draft. We really wanted to bring it to you in chunks, but every time we kind of did, you guys would ask questions about different sections that kind of went along with the zoning district. So we thought, you know what, we'll just give it to you. But I fully expect over the next several months of workshops and planning commission and council input that this will evolve and incorporate your feedback. And then we will then have a public draft that we will bring forward to a public meeting. And then we'll take any of that final feedback and put it into a final draft that will then come to planning commission and this council for adoption. So I just kind of wanted to reiterate, we're still at that working draft phase. While you did get a big fat stack, I don't want you to think this is a done deal. This is very much considered working and evolving. So with that, I did want to get into kind of the format for tonight. And before I do, I would like to say the consultant and I have talked about it, and I think depending on how this night went, but in anticipation of how it would probably go, we will be offering some office hours, so with staff and consultants, so individual one-on-ones or two-on-ones if you want to schedule a meeting with us to go through all your highlights and questions. We are happy to do that and look forward to that conversation. So with our goals for tonight is to kind of make it through as much of the general layout of the plan as possible with kind of three of the following. One is consensus that we're generally going in the right direction. If you've seen, especially things like ADUs that we've already talked about and had a workshop about and incorporated your feedback, hopefully that's a quick, yep, we're good, move on. The next would be kind of questions that you want answered that are really for the good of the group, or things that might be a short 10-15 minute debate, and then we can get consensus from you guys on whether you want us to make a change, and then we'll take that back, make a change, and bring it back with the next workshop. And then lastly, there's definitely going to be some things that come up that really probably need a deep dive. They need their own, workshop, much like ADUs, accessory dwelling units, did. And so with those, I think it'll become evident pretty quickly that those are something that we need to have a deeper conversation about. So we are going to put that up on the board, and we're, hopefully at the end of the night we have, a lot of things we're good on, some things we have some questions and changes, and then we have a set of topics that we then can set up following workshops to really dive into. So that's kind of our goal for tonight. That being said, this is very much informal. We want you to ask questions. We want you to stop us. We want as much feedback from you guys as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our consultant. You've all met Mr. Klepper, Kelly Klepper from Kimley Horn several times. So we're happy to have him here again tonight to walk us through the ordinance. And unless you guys have any questions before we start, we'll just get into it. Okay? All right.
We're ready to roll.
All right. So good evening, Mayor, members of council. For the record, Kelly Klepper with Kimley Horn. I'm going to say two quick things. One, the voice is going a little bit. You're probably going to hear me cough. I'm 3 weeks post-COVID. I am negative 4 times over, so don't worry about that. So you may see me go to either an inhaler or to turn around and take a quick cough, so I apologize right up front. And the second thing, although I love coming to Greer, this incredible community, the weather, like you said, Mayor, not so much tonight. But even on a bad night, as far as weather, it's always a great time to be here. As Ashley said, we want to reiterate, this is a working draft. We started with the pieces and parts. We had some questions. We walked through this with some of the stakeholders, with council, with staff. As Ashley said, you know, we had a little bit of a pause, especially when the staffing changes. We've been working closely with the new planning staff as well as Ashley. And what's been really nice is the fresh set of eyes. One of the things that we as consultants and planners often do is you'll start seeing things the same thing, and it starts to become stale. And it's the same thing when you drive around your community. We could drive around and go, oh, did you realize that? And you're like, I drive by that every day and never noticed it. Same thing with a lot of these codes. So the fresh set of eyes that we have from these young ladies has been critical. So what we want to do tonight there again, we're going to try to make it through as much as we can. I love the fact that Mayor, that you said you've got yellow highlight. 324 pages. I'm sure you've probably got a couple of comments for us.
A few.
So there again, what was the background and purpose? What were we doing? When we first started this, part of it was take a look at our code, do a deep dive. What can we get rid of? What do we need to update? What are you seeing in the best planning practices? And more importantly is to update the standards into a unified development ordinance, taking all the documents that you have from a regulatory standpoint and creating one master document. That way, staff's not looking at one document versus another, and then when one gets updated, the other one doesn't, and then you have inherent conflicts. And that was one of the first things that we did in this process. So that was part of the initial assessment that we did. Was it's been patchworked, it's been patched over time. It's kind of a Band-Aid approach. Didn't reflect your new comprehensive plan, transforming Greer. And so those were some of the easy things that we started looking at. And then it was, when's the last time you looked at parking or signage? What are the biggest issues that you as staff have? What are you seeing as the things that are going to council that are creating the biggest issues and challenges, and what are those? So that's part of the reason that you'll see a lot of the comments that we've provided here. As Ashley said, we've had a pretty robust series of stakeholder meetings throughout the initial portions of the process. I'm not going to read all of these other than to say, this was just kind of a couple of core comments that we received along the way from the stakeholders. There again, some of these things were actually presented to council as well as part of a couple of our other previous workshops. Oh, I didn't even touch it, it's moving. Okay, so what does the new UDO look like? So 8 sections, and like I said, this takes together 2 documents. So everything from an administration component all the way through to general definitions. And we're going to walk through some of the higher components of each of these sections. We're not going to do a deep dive into 324 pages or the fact that there's 20 plus pages in administration or what some of this means, unless you, of course, have a specific question and go, so Kelly and Ashley, why did you recommend this? And that's what we want to hear tonight, because what we don't want to have is we come out of this workshop, we have a false sense of reality of like, hey, everybody's great. And then we come back with a couple of more revisions, come out for the public document, and then all of a sudden there's all kinds of questions or challenges. So there again, we want to make sure we're trying to address those, and as Ashley said, something that we found to be extremely critical and invaluable are those office hours. What are those one-on-one meetings? Breaking it down into an hour, sitting down and going, okay, Ashley and Kelly, I'm on page 28. Talk to me about this. And it's a one-on-one discussion. We get so much feedback and so much great information from those discussions. I would love to say that every UDO that we write, every council member takes us up on that. Unfortunately, it's only about half. So I'm going to challenge this group to say I'm going to have at least 7 individual meetings, or a couple, we'll say. So when we started looking at it, there again, some of this was is things that you've already looked at. It was the consolidation of some of the districts and trying to simplify and streamline some of those. What we realized early on was that some of the districts were very much the exact same thing. So we said, why have two districts that do pretty much the same thing when you can consolidate those, make some minor changes, and like I said, start to free up some of not only your staff time, but also some of the other resources that you have. The other thing was to create new districts that also reflect your comprehensive plan, because there again, the comprehensive plan is supposed to inform your code and your zoning districts. What we started realizing is, great plan, now there's a big gap between some of that and some of your standards. So let's talk about section 1, administration. This is I'll say, one of the more straightforward components. Doesn't take, a lot of modification or things, but there are things in here that did get recommended for modification. Under the administration, what we're identifying are not only the processes and procedures that are going to govern the use of the UDO, but also what each of your boards and this council are going to be reviewing. What stage, who makes a recommendation, as well as who has final decision-making authority. The one thing I will say is a lot of this is still, of course, based off of either your existing code components, or more importantly, is reflecting the updates that have occurred in South Carolina's planning laws. So some of this, you'll start to see individual sections. You'll see check marks, you'll see R, which is a review, D, decision maker. So that way you can start to see who has that final review and approval authority. The other thing that we start to identify in this particular section is not only the who's, but also the different processes that you as a city have moving forward. Whether it's a rezoning versus a special exception versus annexation versus a variance versus historic. And there again, making sure that it's very clearly identified and delineated what the board is, what the makeup is, what's their charge, and then there again, what is their responsibility in the overall growth and development and redevelopment of the city itself. I'm going to ask, and I'm actually, before I start moving into individual sections, I'm just going to ask, is there anything, I'll say big topic, or anything that the council would like to bring up on section 1?
Is that administration?
Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, let me just say this. I'm going to try not to ask hardly any questions. I've gone through, I reviewed administration all the way through page 85, did a high-level review, and then you should have a copy of staff. All the council does my questions. I think the biggest thing in administration that popped out at me was in our effort to be open government. It was very general as to how all boards, we would record the meetings, that kind of thing. And my question is it the intent for the meeting minutes to be transcribed, so they'll be on file and open for review by council and public, and will we be broadcasting our meetings?
So let me take the second one first. That's not an administration component of the UDO. That is a policy and administrative decision of this body. How often you meet, do you publish whatever at that point? That is strictly up to the board as far as that direction. That's not something that we control through the UDO. The transcribing of minutes, there again, there are certain things that are required under state law to be maintained as part of the permanent record. So there again, some of those items that are controlled or regulated by that aspect that are separate from a UDO, those items have not been incorporated in here, or at least have not been specifically, or may just be reflected in by reference.
I think another good example of that is the fact that, under the new UDO, it simply says that council confirms planning and zoning members for the board, but by policy we say that individual council members nominate those then to be elected by the board. So I'm assuming that that's
another example of where the administrative part of it differs from what our policy responsibilities are or we choose to enforce.
That's absolutely correct, Mayor.
Thanks. Others?
We ready? Okay.
There is one other question I had. Under 1.3.3 administrative adjustments, it said administrative adjustment approval criteria. I quote out of the sentence, city staff, and or city council will make those decisions. And my question was, who determines who makes those decisions?
Excuse me. Well, I just realized I've got a misnumbering on one item as far as page 28 is concerned, but you did say, I'm sorry, Council Member 133 under the administrative adjustments.
1.3.3.
Gotcha. Okay. So, and I assume you were talking about what would normally be item C that I mislabeled as B? The administrative adjustment procedure, or?
It's item C, staff review.
Okay, so you're on page 29.
Capital C,
Yes, sir.
lowercase b.
Okay. And I'm sorry, what was your question, Commissioner? Or council member, excuse me? Is that a Board of County Commissioners meeting 2 days ago?
In the document, it says, they're talking about decisions being made at either the staff and or council level. But who determines, I mean, is that going to be in the document, or is that legislation that's yet to be made?
There are certain items that fall under the purview of staff that we've identified, and that's the reason we say either city staff and or city council. So there are certain things that automatically are the interpretation and review and approval by the city council versus staff. Of course, this body has the authority to say, yep, you know what? We want to have it go through the Board of Zoning Appeals and then to us as far as some of those administrative adjustments. And establishing those criteria. The one thing that we want to try to do is at least identify that there is a process for those minor adjustments without having to go through a full public hearing process every time. So there again, if there are things that the council would say, hey, that really should all come to us. We just need to know what those specific items are. There again, there's nothing that says staff is the end-all be-all to all of these. To the contrary, you all are the ones elected. You get to make the decisions. So you could actually say, no, we want this, this, and this to come to us for administrative adjustments. Or going to default to Mr. Merriman.
Anything else in administration?
Okay, we'll move on to zoning, section 2. And I apologize, it gets worse as the night goes on, and so it's going to be interesting. So there again, zoning is not to be misconstrued or misunderstood to also be your development standards or some of the uses. So what we did under section 2 was to establish the specific districts themselves. So you can see on the screen here, what we did is to create what we're called the use groupings, whether it's residential, non-residential, mixed use, or the special districts. So trying to group those districts into those like terms, because what we found out through the process was that a lot of your residential have similar types of approaches, similar types of standards and characteristics. So let's put those in a group. And this actually translates through to a lot of the other components that we have, including signage and parking as well as section 4, which gets into our specific use tables. So the biggest question we have, of course, is, you all have seen this before. We've seen it a couple of different times through the workshop process. The stakeholders have reviewed it. And the thing that we just basically wanted to ask as part of this tonight is, did we get the right districts, the right number? Too many, too few? Or is it pretty much keep moving and let's get into the meat of some of these districts under the uses, which is section 4, or some of the design and development standards in 5 and 6? And I'm going to walk through briefly each of the districts. There again, you've seen this information before. The other aspect of this is all the tables and all the information is laid out exactly the same. And that was one of the things we understood and determined early on was different times when different codes were being updated, there was a different format and approach. So there again, what we said was, okay, we're going to have those 3 main components, whether it's the lot and the density standards. That's going to be consistent throughout every single residential district. The setback and the height standards, same type of look. Standards are going to be a little different. And in the case that you can see here with traditional neighborhood, whether it is attached, so townhouses or some of the other items, detached, 1 house per lot, or where we do have some provision in allocations for non-residential, what are those quick look standards within those areas? The other thing, of course, are some of the other standards. So if there are other components within the code itself, then we start to identify where those can be found, whether it's the parking, setbacks, some of the additional use standards, or even some of the design standards. All of those are additionally cross-referenced here so that the reader and the user does not have to try to figure out, okay, so what am I doing with parking? What am I doing with this? There again, it's in a very simple, easy-to-use table. Same thing with medium-density residential, establishing the designations in the districts. They're also looking at attached and detached. We look at the high density, and we identify, what those density components are, as well as building heights. Then we get into the non-residential, whether it's the office professional. There again, you can still see that similar type of look and feel, although we didn't do, the one thing you'll notice is there's not a residential and non-residential component here. This is only because what is allowed per the code with respect to non-residential standards. The commercial general. This is a brand new district, the business technology, and this is intended to be kind of those transitional areas between some of your larger employment areas that you have that could also not only be traditional types of employment, but also, I'm not going to call it the smart park because the Research Triangle actually had that copyrighted a number of years ago, but where you have those new and emerging types of businesses and industries. What we wanted to do is to create a new district that would support those types of uses, whether it be small manufacturing or small logistics or small research to larger facilities.
So Kelly, let me
Yes, sir.
jump in just 1 second because I think it brings up a good point and one that I had a question about. In terms of identifying these standards as we move through some of these, it occurred to me that best practices and new ideas oftentimes are worthy of consideration and maybe even incorporation. So in terms of the standards that we've gotten, are these from sort of tried and true, or is this, or do these come from some of the places that that already have these designs incorporated and that sort of thing? One of the things that I think is going to be important to us is going to be the flexibility as we have folks that come to us that want to do new or different things that we may or may not have considered. And I think it's going to be important for us to have some flexibility in that regard. So where did these come from, so to speak?
So I'm not going to be too shy when I say that, yes, to answer your question, Mayor, these are items that we've worked with me personally for the past 30 years. When I was in Georgetown, Kentucky, very much like Greer, of course we talked about that, home of Toyota, we ended up creating a BP1, a business park approach, because of a couple of different reasons. That park is thriving, almost 20 years since I left there. This is also from research that we've done looking at other communities, other codes that we've written, whether it be in North Carolina or Tennessee, but more importantly, applying that standard to what is Greer. Not just carbon copy, take it off the shelf, change the name to protect the innocent, but bringing those concepts to bear And then, in working with staff, saying, what do we want to try to achieve with this new district? Now, the other thing is there are provisions in this for the flexibility on multiple occasions. Some of that goes back to those administrative adjustments and those provisions. Other things are actually in here that allow for, brand new uses that are unlisted. Gives you a process to be able to identify and accept those using certain standards. Parking the same way, the landscaping and buffering the same way. The one thing that we said early on, and I think I even said this during our interview, is we do not propose or like to recommend a code that is so hard and fast that there's not flexibility. There's got to be a range. The example I used, I think, including during our interview, was restaurants. Most codes, and I know I'm getting off the beat to the business technology, but this is a great example. Most codes treat restaurants exactly the same, whether it is a Starbucks, a Chick-fil-A, or even a Subway. We all know that all of those have inherently different approaches. Why do we code something that is one size fits all, knowing that that's the case? That's the reason you see the mins and maxes and the ability to make modifications through a specific process.
Let me jump off on that one as well, because when all this began, I think one of the things that sold me that we needed to do it, besides updating things that were out of date, was more flexibility. Now, I have done a high-level review, that's it. But when I go through these districts, excluding residential, I'll give you an example, is that we have a minimum height and a maximum height. Well, that doesn't leave us any flexibility, and already, for instance, I don't know the area, what it's going to be designated, but let's say south of 85 and 14, that medical research across the road.
Research Park.
Right, and I think the maximum height we could have is 90 feet. There's already an existing building that's over 100 feet. So why wouldn't we, I don't know, I mean, and then there's another, I'll give you another example, and I don't know if this would apply. And I think you call it manufacturing commercial, is that?
The manufacturing logistics?
Yes,
Yes,
okay.
sir.
We have a business that's located in Greer, but in the county, but they are a big part of our city. And if these regulations were in place, and if they were in the city, but they could not have, well, they've got a process tower that's 190 feet tall. Some of their buildings exceed the maximum heights, I think, that you allow. So I don't want it to be a detriment for us to recruit business. And one final example. I know on multifamily we have height restrictions. In the downtown area we have height restrictions, but my comment about that is a lot of this should be based on where it's at, what it's surrounded by, the topography, because I notice we make a big effort of screening the roof from the ground so people can't see it. But if you go Moore Street's right here, lower side of Moore Street, and somebody wants to take down a piece of property that can be seen from downtown, if they are to build to the height restriction, then when you're on the other side of the railroad tracks, all you're looking at is the rooftop. So if in any of those scenarios, how hard is it to somebody come in and say, no, we need to be at 120 feet, or we need to be at 60 feet versus 45 feet? Now, is that something that is going to be another month for a committee? They have to pay fees to do to go before a board, or is that something? I mean, how is that handled? Because I thought we really we wanted more flexibility.
I mean, I think the answer is administrative adjustment does allow for a little bit, but that's like 10 to 15%. I think what we actually hear you saying is our maximum is too low. So,
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that why write a regulation and we already have buildings that exceed those heights?
well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the city that has developed that is not the way we want it to be. So the question is,
So
are
we don't
those
want-
okay?
We don't want the cancer center?
I didn't say that. I'm saying we still need general regulations for how we want it to be. So what I'm hearing is I think our max is too low, that you are okay with 100 feet, 120 feet, or towers having an exception.
Well, not necessarily. It's just that
I mean, that we,
because we don't live on flat land. I mean, from Moore Street to here, there's probably a 10-foot difference in elevation. So if you're trying to achieve something, a look, then you want a stumpy looking building down here when it's compared to everything up here. Because I understand why, like in our downtown, we say there's a height limitation because most of the buildings don't exceed 3 stories. But you could put a 3-story building over here and it's gonna kind of look like a stump when you compare it to the rest of the place. I don't want to take a document and make things right now. It seems like if somebody came in and they wanted to do another cancer research center, same part of town, that under the old regulations, they could do it, right? Is that right?
Did we not do that by exception, Ruthie?
We did
I
it
don't
by
know.
exception. And is that how that would be handled?
I mean, in theory, right now, that would be a variance, but I don't know that that would necessarily meet the criteria. I mean, it sounds like we need maybe height
Minimums.
special exception
Well, that's-
versus a variance, and that's considered based on neighborhood compatibility. That still would likely be a Board of Zoning Appeals decision unless council was okay with staff making that decision.
Well, so why reinvent the wheel? You know, we handled the cancer center without, and I'm not knocking any of this, please, don't get me wrong.
No, I'm
But
not-
why
I'll take
rewrite it and you're already costing, just in the planning stages, time and money because they're asking for a variance? I mean, what's the difference? I mean, why do all of this when we already did it? And because I really think that, I thought that there was going to be more room for thought in how something's going to look, or not so much, well, this is how you can build it. Is that?
So if I could, one is the process and the project you were talking about, and as Ruthie said, it was a public process. It was time and review and everything else. We're not changing the fact that there is still a public process on a case-by-case basis. You could come in here and still follow those processes and procedures similar to what you're doing right now. We're not sitting here saying, other than the areas that are within the GSP overlay, the airport overlay, we're not saying thou shalt not be able to do ask for any exceptions or variances or modifications.
No, I understand
Yeah.
that, and you've offered a lot of different regulation for different areas. But why start off lower than something that already exists? And I understand you try to achieve a look, but you also have to remember that besides space needs, the reason buildings go vertical is the cost of dirt. And our dirt is getting very expensive. And so we're going to see more and more calls to go vertical versus spreading out.
Right. Again, it sounds like our maximum
So, yeah, I think
is
that's
too low.
Well, I think that's the point. Mr. Airwood, can I ask, let me just, maybe, I think this is what I'm hearing, is, for instance, if the hospital is this baseline, and we know that that was acceptable through a variance process, to Ashley's point, well, then that's just going to be the new standard. So that max height of the hospital in this particular case is just what we codify as that maximum height, and you don't, kind of like Charleston does, you don't go any higher than the steeples. You kind of set that as a standard in that district because it already exists. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, yes, but, and I don't know, I don't have a map, but I don't know what that hospital area is will be classified as. And you could put another building out there that was, that building's 7 or 8 stories tall. You could put another building out there that was 10 or 12. It would all match. So, but if you wanted to do 8-story building right here downtown, right now, that don't match.
Right.
And so
Yep.
I don't know,
I think the
Partially
goal.
the intent
Sorry, go
behind
ahead.
that is the districts or nodes, as a lot of people are using now, is how you define what makes 7 or 8 stories appropriate in one place, but not in another place.
yes, exactly.
Right.
And I thought that's what we were trying to achieve and trying to have flexibility.
And this is just one example right here that,
Right, I think the difference is that might have been commercial 3 versus now we have new zoning districts that are regional center. So they could request a rezoning where they are by right, or if, it's like giving general outlines that are more flexible, but staff would then make a recommendation on whether that was appropriate in that area. But it still sounds like some of these districts you think are too low. So I'd like to go through and just consensus, like, well, we've already raised them once based on your feedback from last time, so it sounds like we still missed the mark, which is fine, that's what we want to hear. So manufacturing and logistics, regional center, sounds like they need to be higher. 120 or, exempt towers.
Well, and then the
That,
manufacturing area, what if we got another plant that they use processed towers? Because that's very typical in a lot of manufacturing, other than automobile construction. And hopefully, over time, we want to diversify our economy where we're not relying on the automobile industry near as much. And so there may be somebody who says, I need a tower for processing, and it's going to be 120 feet. Or, I've already got a tower that's 60 feet, but I need to increase it by 100 feet to put this new line in. That's where I think flexibility needs to be incorporated, because I understand there are some things you have to say no, but there's other things that you need to be able to say, yeah, this is going to be a good fit for us, and we have the ability to do that.
so point made.
Yeah.
And we'll move from there.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we want to do, though, is in thinking through this long term, is we understand that people are going to build to the limits, whatever the limits are.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful about that in some regard. And so, maybe this is something that we address with what we think is a practical or reasonable limit with an administrative ability to go 50%
Well, that
higher
would be-
or
that would
whatever.
fall back to the planning
Or that
commission.
beyond 50%, it comes to a decision by the council.
That's right, because you would say, okay, they've done, they have come and they've asked for a rezoning. In that zoning, you're allowed X. And they need to do X plus 10. So I don't know how that's done administratively and ordinance-wise, but that should be grouped. Planning Commission probably should review it. And then, as we always do, we give yea or nay on it.
Sure. Yeah, we're gonna be in the City Club at Columbia next week on the 20th floor eating supper. So you're looking at everybody's roof in Columbia from there, so.
Right, but I mean, if we're making such a big effort, if you read through a lot of this stuff, there's effort, there is expense that people have to go through for any kind of units, whatever they are, HVAC, hot tubs, that go on the roof, there's a big requirement for screening. And so if somebody has to invest that kind of money and then, you know, their neighbors that are 2 blocks away but are 10 foot less elevation, and these people up here on their roof can look straight down on these, that kind of, I don't know, that's just not.
So, Councilman Airwood, if I could, and I'll give you 2 real-world examples. I just worked on a orchestra facility for a brand-new concert hall. And one of the big considerations was the maximum height, very similar to what we're talking about here, but because of where the stage and some of the acoustical equipment needed to go, they needed to go 110 feet versus 90. There again, it's up to this body to say, we're okay with this height by right, and what we're good with staff, and then more importantly, what we as council want to see come back. You know, we've looked at a couple of different things, and the other thing is, you know, when you do it by right, and I know you all know this, it is by right. It comes straight in for a building permit, still have the expense of a site and development plan, your engineering and all of that, but Ruthie and her folks review it, make sure and checks the boxes, and it starts construction. And you all never see those things. Same thing with the staff administration components. You know, and this is where, when I say the trust factor, when you've got an incredible staff right here with Ashley, period. You know, there's that trust level that she's going to do the right thing based off of these criteria. But you got to give her the tools to be able to make those decisions. So there again, exactly what we're saying here, and Mr. Merriman, I appreciate you interjecting on that. We're at the stage right now with where we are with a code. You could say, hey, you know what? We're good with X, Y, and Z. We're going to make it the code. Guess what? And you all vote to approve it. That's it. That's what you, I mean, that's what we give you at that point. This is the exact kind of feedback we need.
All right, let's.
And I will say administrative adjustments are new. We currently don't have any authority to approve anything other than what is in that code. So we were a little conservative, not knowing if you'd be comfortable with staff making those decisions. So again, those 10, 15, that they're pretty low. So if you're comfortable with staff making a decision based on those criteria that you define, a little bit more so they don't have to go through an extra process, that's great. I mean, I still have the ability to be like, I don't feel very comfortable. I really want Planning Commission to weigh in or BZA to weigh in. And so I can always say, I'm not making that call. We're taking this. But if, again, this was a baby step and a totally new thing. So it sounds like you're maybe open to a little bit more administrative adjustment, which I certainly won't argue with.
That's a point we can talk through as we go along.
What?
Absolutely.
So just to kind of keep everything moving, there again, and Mr. Airwood, I definitely appreciate the thoughts that goes into that and the consideration. Towers and things like that. Well, I mean, one, you're not going to have a city full of towers. So, you know, those kind of considerations, you know, the one-offs, that's the one thing we always are trying to look at. And what is the typical height that we're seeing across the city? Or, you know, what's the consideration for topography? Because topography is a big thing. And we realize that all day long, especially because, you know, we could go from here just down the road and you've got about a 40 plus foot elevation change just in that area right there within that one strip. So that's one thing that we did take a look into consideration of. Just kind of continue to move through the districts. There again, we have Greer Station, that is your downtown district. That reflects, there again, that kind of cultural and heartbeat of the city, the Greer Station, the old, the nomenclature that ties us back to what is the downtown. And then we start getting into some of the other mixed-use areas, the neighborhood center. So those are the areas that are kind of on those fringe of the neighborhoods where we want to see some mixture of residential, but also some non-residential components. And this is where we start really getting into that form and function, in addition to just thou shalt be 30 feet back from the road. So we're trying to look at some design standards that allows still the flexibility, but we're still in keeping of the character, like Poinsett. There's a great development pattern that goes along that. If you want buildings a little bit closer to the street or the sidewalk, then that's the reason you see the min and the max in some of these areas. The other thing that you'll see within the mixed-use districts, and this is a caveat and a catch that we always catch a lot of different communities on. They'll say, okay, we've got minimums as far as the min and max on the front, the side, and the rear, and they still require parking. And it's like, okay, all the parking's in the rear, but yet you've got a 50-foot maximum building setback in the rear. Or on the side, you've got a 10-foot maximum. How's the car getting back? Oh, we use an alley. Everybody's got an alley? So there you go. We've tried to kind of right-size some of this stuff. And this is going to be another one of those things. Take a look at those standards and start to kind of realize that a typical double row, or I'll say a single aisle double loaded parking area is about 64 feet wide without the landscaping. So 20-foot depth space, 24-foot minimum as far as a 2-lane traffic, another 20 feet. So there's your 64. Plus if you have sidewalks or some of the other landscaping and buffering. So we start looking at some of those depths at that point. And some of the numbers you'll see here reflect the potential for some of those buffers that we have between the specific districts. So there again, trying to ensure that we still can actually develop that property and develop it in the right way. Regional center, that's your bigger areas, kind of those core intersections between the interstate and major arterials or two major arterials. And there again, that's the area where you're really kind of getting out into, I'll say more of your, I'm not going to say traditional development patterns that you see, but that is those large-scale projects and developments that you're seeing that you wouldn't see in the downtown area. But they're getting closer to the interstates. Same thing with the commercial center. Then we get into two of our special districts, the planned development. They're again trying to give staff a little bit more flexibility in how we approach things. There's trade-offs in this district that, if you want to take advantage of some of the additional provisions that we're allowing, the city is getting some things in return. So it's not just, hey, I want to do this. Well, great. The city likes and wants this. So there's those trade-offs. And they're, again, purely optional. And applicants can say, no, we don't want to do this. Okay, well, we've got 3 other options that you can do exactly what you're doing or wanting to do within the city. There again, a couple of these are truly optional approaches. So one of the items that we also definitely wanted to talk about tonight, and is definitely thinking that there's going to be some discussion, are the overlays and those design standards that go with it. Right now, I want to ask the council a question. How many overlays do you currently have within the city per your code? If you're right, you get a Ricola. Not the one in my pocket either. I've got one in my bag.
7.
Close.
I was gonna say 6.
There's closer.
8.
I got one of my- I do that with some of the workshops. I'll actually have a bag of like Snickers and other things like that. And it's like, okay, you get the right answer, you're getting candy. It goes over real well to some extent. But right now you have 8 overlays. And those are scattered all across the city. So I'm going to skip this one because it's a repeat. Those are the areas that you have right now. The first thing we did when we looked at that was go, holy cow. We have 8 in a city this size. And then we said, well, it's actually not that bad because a lot of the standards are the same. And then we started looking and go, well, but you don't have standards in some of the other ones. And they abut each other. So what we proposed was to take the 8, and I'm gonna say we did not touch the airport overlay. That one is set, that is something that we're not touching with the 10-foot pole. But, you know, what we said was, your approaches to the city are pretty much the same. Why do we treat them differently? You know, if it's an eastern approach versus a western approach, but it's all coming into the downtown area. And you start looking at what's going on, whether it's that transitional area with some of the houses being converted to offices. You know, why do we treat one side differently than the other? So we said, let's just make those some of these entryway components. Let's look at strengthening the standards, because what we heard loud and clear from the stakeholders was these areas that we have, they were established for a reason. We want higher design standards, especially in these areas, with respect to signage and parking and buffering and some of our building standards. So what we did is, and this also aligns with your comprehensive plan, was to create 4. So your historic district overlay, so the historic district stays exactly the same. That's established by ordinance. We had a discussion with the Board of Architectural Review, and, you know, listened to them quite a bit. I've actually got several notes in there. But, you know, their boundary was set. We were like, okay, let's leave that exactly where it is, leave the majority of their standards or all of their standards in play, because a lot of that is also National Historic Register components. The other thing is said, okay, so the downtown transitional, what's that first area immediately adjacent to the historic but going out to a certain district or a certain component? And those are the areas when we were driving around looking at the maps and also looking at a lot of things, there was a lot of similarities within, I'll say, these areas, as you're kind of starting to see almost like that core downtown area that supports the historic. So we said, why do we treat there again some of these areas differently? Let's create a uniform kind of sub area that's very much similar to the downtown area and the Greer Station standards. 3.3, which is the entryway, that's the one that we did the most, I'll call it surgery, because as you can see on the map, actually you can't see on the map because it's on my screen. That would be the next slide. You can start to see those are your core corridors that are coming into the city. Now you may say, hey Kelly, great, point set, really should be separate because of this. Perfect, let us know, because, you know, there's nothing that says you can only have 4. We could go back to 8, although it becomes an enforcement nightmare, and Ashley and the staff trying to go, okay, where are we and which standard are we applying here? There again, if we can start looking at some of these core corridors that are very similar in nature, applying the same standards, then you're going to have that uniform kind of look that the city has expressed as part of their comprehensive plan process. There again, it's not rocket science, it's not thou shalt have this extend and this. We did try to respect the boundaries of the existing overlays and a lot of the core standards, but also look to upscale or upsize some of the standards to be more uniform across the board. And this is just the example of the entryway. So just the overall intent. What are we trying to achieve? You know, enhance the architectural quality and site development, well-planned development. Some of this is straight out of your comprehensive plan, but then of course this intent goes into specific standards that, like I said, we've looked at and vetted with staff. There again, a lot of information in there, and it may not be the correct thing that this group wants. It may be, there again, not enough. So that's one of those things that we want to be able to hear from you. One, why did we choose these areas? Why did we consolidate, or why did we pick this standard?
I've got a few specific questions about the overlays. One is for the historic overlay, and I understand why you do it. I think there's some verbiage that probably needs to be changed to make it consistent throughout the document. But you have under architectural design style, you give dates, 1890 through 1930, and that gives us a point of reference. And then it starts dictating, like for instance, windows, manufacturer painted aluminum, metal, or wood with clear glass or stained glass. What are we trying to achieve there?
Is this in the historic? Because the historic is unchanged from our current downtown overlay. It's just now limited to a much smaller area.
No, I'm talking about some design standards and just kind of wondering why they're in here.
They were written and by SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and considered with our historic district. So I would hesitate to make changes to the historic district, but I do think the transitional area, we can definitely make less strict.
Well,
But that's up to you. I mean,
well,
you all,
I'll tell you this, I think my question was, what are we trying to achieve there? Not where it came from, but what are we trying to achieve? It's a look, correct?
yes.
Okay, trying to achieve a look. You are asking or defining what a window besides its glass can be made of. And I don't know why we are so stuck on the material, because between 1890 and 1930, they didn't have extruded aluminum. They didn't have a lot of metal type windows. So I'm wondering why, and if this was copied from the state, that's bad, because manufactured painted aluminum, metal, or wood, well, painted aluminum is a metal. So I don't know, but my question is what we're trying to achieve. Why don't we open it up for more material? Because there can be, there's a lot better material out there than wood that'll last much longer. And then another on the exterior facade, we talk about brick. And here again, I ask, what are we trying to achieve? And it's a look. Is that what we're trying to achieve?
Yes, and I will say that this does not apply to this red. It only applies to a very small, it will only apply if this is adopted
you.
to the historic
No,
district.
I got you. And so with brick, we're trying to achieve a look. So under brick, you've got something that's, it looks benign, but it says the brick shall not exceed a projection over 1 inch in any single course. But if you really want to look at how brickwork looks well in a building that was built in that time period, look at the Davenport House. Look at the corbelling all over. There's probably not masons that can even do that now. But just to say you can only bring out a brick 1 inch, I don't know where that came from and what the purpose was, because you're not going to do a whole lot.
Sure. I'll be completely honest. We did not touch that section because it was so vetted at the time by State Historic Preservation Office staff and brought to this council that we can have them come out and help us, but we did not get into a lot of changes there.
So why are we beholden to the state with that?
We're not, but they're the experts, so we took their advice and adopted it.
Well, I'm
So,
looking
I
at
mean, I
what-
guess
If they want to qualify for.
if they want to qualify for
they have to go
historic
through that
district and
office.
tax credits, they have to do
That's
that.
what
So,
cost us 6 to 9 months and $500,000 to do county bank was have a, 8-10 foot door
But if we're trying to,
recreated out of wood.
So
Couldn't use tinted glass on any of the windows.
well, and that goes back to our intent. What are we trying to achieve in this little district? Is it a district, what the state says go is good, or what we know is best and what we think looks the best? I got it. You can't, but we're only talking about, if they want to obtain these funds, then they can build to state specs. But what if they don't care about that? What if they want to do their thing and we're restricting corbelling on brick and we're restricting windows with the material that they can buy and install windows versus, I mean, any kind of material that could be as good or better, because we don't know in a year or in 10 years what materials are going to be out there on the market. So
I mean, the intent is to help preserve the local historic district. So if that's not important to council and the community, then I think we can consider a lot of changes.
Well,
But those were well vetted back in the day. Again, that wasn't something we spent a lot of time on because it was well vetted.
I'm not saying that we take away any look, and if we have something happens and a building is torn down or falls down, for whatever reason, somebody wants to go back up, are we going to, although it's going to look like downtown, but are we going to let them, and say they want to spend a lot of money on the brickwork, are we going to allow that? Well, here we can't allow that. All we're doing is kind of a plain Jane kind of deal. So I don't know, I mean, or is it something that the state says we have to do to have this district, or is it something the state says if a building owner wants to qualify for funds?
I mean, I'll have to do some additional research and call them, but I mean, if we want to protect
I think
the
it's the
historic
designation.
district,
It's the designation.
you want to
that forces
protect
you
the
to do that,
district.
yeah. So you would have to remove the historic
Because
designation.
having one not comply jeopardizes the district, not just the ability of them to get tax credits.
Yeah,
So,
that's my understanding.
yeah, I think this maybe we need to move forward, but
We
I
can quantify that pretty easy, but I think it's.
will say this only applies to like 15, 17 properties on the Heart of Trade, so.
Well, that's right, and I think we don't want to lose the fact that it may only apply to 15 or so buildings right now. But at any point in time, tonight, a year down the road, there could be something that literally destroys. There could be an earthquake. And I guarantee you that every one of these buildings that were built at the turn of the century would crumble. And
Well, they no longer qualify for the historic district.
Yes, but
They
then.
can be
but
built
then-
back anyway.
But then if they build back, they're still restricted to this, isn't it? Because this comes from the state.
Not once the historic status is lost.
I mean, I think at that point, we'd review it and rescind that overlay and make it the transitional. I mean, I don't think we need, I think we have options if something catastrophic like that happened.
If it happens to one building, so if it happens to one building or two buildings, this fire burns down two buildings.
If it burns down two buildings, then I think that.
Depends on the building.
It does. It depends what's contributing.
If it's
I
under
mean,
if it's under the historic district, then I would assume it'll lose its status as a historic building. You can put back whatever you wanted to at that point.
Because there's no building there that's historic.
well, you do jeopardize the district, though. So we have individual status and we have a district.
Okay, within the district.
So.
All right. I don't know.
Well, let's just clarify
Yeah.
about that.
I can call SHPO and ask some more questions. In general, what we heard, though, was this very, very, very strict, currently applies to pretty much that whole red area. And what we heard from you was, it's too strict. So what we did was restricted it to just the historic district and then did a less strict version in the transitional and then again in the entryway. So we,
I think my
like,
question is.
does it
I
hit the mark?
have no issue with building back or modifying where it looks the same. But if somebody still wants to make it look the same but go to the extra level of adding more detail, Because we do have that existing detail in downtown.
So is the question, are these minimum standards from SHPO? Is that what you're asking, Mr. Airwood? Because you're saying,
No,
you,
these are not minimum. This is, what I highlighted, brick shall not exceed a projection over 1 inch in any course.
okay. We'll clarify.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know what that means. If I'm looking at the elevations, I'm gonna count on SHPO's approval, and so is BAR probably. So maybe that shouldn't be in the ordinance.
We probably need to know those things because that's very important for a look. But if you
Yeah.
wanted a visual example, go look at the Davenport house.
Yeah. In general, do we have consensus that we are okay lessening the strictness of the current overlay outside of our
Outside the district?
historic district?
You got my approval.
That's one question. Second question is, we also heard from BAR and from stakeholders from previous rezoning cases, the recommendation was to expand the current downtown overlay to include some of the residential area that you see. So that honestly was not staff driven. Staff doesn't necessarily recommend that. But that did come from BAR and it did come from things we'd heard. So do we have some consensus that we're okay with that? Or do we think that maybe needs to just stick to our current overlay boundary?
I'm not, I don't like it because
Okay.
the color palette, and I'm so far away from what I promised I was gonna do because
That's okay, we
I thought
want
our
this
meeting was
feedback.
not-
This is what we
were gonna
wanted.
do this.
It's
But-
okay.
And a lot of this stuff, you can answer for me on my questions, and I'll have more questions. But,
Yeah, great.
the color palette for a lot of, for the downtown overlay is very limited, correct? I mean,
Currently, I'll have to recheck the downtown transitional. I can't remember if we
Okay,
stick
are we
to the
talking-
Victorian.
Now, you just said downtown overlay or
So
downtown
right now, it's called the downtown overlay, and it applies to most of the red on the screen.
Yes.
So that's,
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's very
If you
confusing with
want-
all the
my
new
opinion
names,
is I
but,
don't want to expand it because it limits especially some residents, and I know they say they're okay with it and they would really support it, but when you go to paint your house, you don't want somebody, one, you don't want to have to go get an approval. Two, you want to have a pretty good choice. And one of the examples we talked about in one of our meetings was that you can't paint a house red, right? That's not, because most of the colors are they're muted.
they're muted, they are, they're Victorian or
But
Craftsman.
there are houses, and it may not be in that district, but it's on, is it Beard Street, red, and it's always looked good. So
Okay.
that's my opinion about.
So if I could just summarize and say something real quick. One is, we heard loud and clear, the area that had all the additional limitations and restrictions was way too big. So that's the reason, they're, like Ashley said, pull it back to what is actually designated by the state and the city as the historic district. Focus in on those core areas, keep that like that. Everything else is still under a design standard, but it gives exactly what you're talking about, Mr. Arrowood, which is more flexibility of materials, colors, approaches, and things like that, while still adhering to the vision, but not to the level of construction. I've worked with a number of historic districts from Kingsport, Tennessee, which was an old Nolan community, Knoxville, Dunedin, down in Florida, as well as some places around Georgia and North Carolina. It's on record. Some of the standards go way too far, and I agree with you, and that's the reason we pulled it back. Pure and simple.
So I had two kind of head nods against expanding the area, even a less strict area. Do
Yeah,
I
I
have a general consensus of that, or still not quite sure?
Yeah, I don't think the transition overlay really makes sense for some of the homes there. You
Okay.
know, I think that arbitrary line just doesn't, it's not consistent with, I mean, it'd be different if a lot of the homes had the same properties, but I mean, if I'm looking down Morrow Street visually, I'm like, none of those homes really would make sense if
Okay.
they go back to fix them up, going to those standards. So, I mean, I'm fine with us pulling it in. I mean, riding through the neighborhood, see what makes sense as the line, or what is the current one.
Okay. And then a couple of conversations I had with the administrator this week, it sounds like there may also be some interest in another sub-district, kind of a little bit south of Trade between the two railroad tracks that we may want to consider a little bit different, allowing a little more height because they're between the railroad tracks and kind of bookending the city. So I think we'll probably bring that back to you next time. That conversation came up in the last week or so. So I know I'm springing that one on
Yeah,
you,
we'll work
but.
on that. Yeah.
But just a heads up that will probably be a change. So we'll bring you back a modified red and maybe even a sub-district with a few different, like, height restrictions, and a little less strict again. So,
I like using the designation historic for those areas that are truly historic, because, you know, other than the fact that Riley's lived in his house for 150 years, that makes it historic. I mean, that area where we live is not necessarily historic, except for the fact that there are 3 or 4 streets that date back to, you know, the very early 1900s, and there is some history there. But by far and away, the vast majority of that community was built in the 50s. I mean, you know, so.
Except for the stadium.
Except for the stadium. And so, you know, what gives that area its flavor is more community than it is building standards. And I think it adds uniqueness to that area, that if my wife likes painting our front door yellow, she can do it. And if we're going to change it to pink, which we're talking about, she can do it. So, you know,
love it.
I think that
For the
there's
record,
plenty
I
of
agree.
Yeah. For the record, I think having that, and even this mix of some new housing lends life to that area. I'm not against it at all.
all right. And we did, Mr. Booker, I believe it was you who suggested we add Arlington. And so we did add Arlington as one of the entryway corridors. That was one of the changes that y'all talked about at your last workshop. So I did want to
Definitely.
just call that out.
Yeah.
So sounds like we're pretty good with that.
I did notice.
I'm looking to see if the other staff's taking notes, because
Oh, we're recording.
I'm kidding.
I'll be listening to it.
I'm kidding. So let's move on to the next section, section 4, which are the uses, and this is probably the second biggest component behind the establishment of the districts. Some people may go, well, actually, Kelly, this is probably the bigger one, because this is where we are actually identifying what you can do within each of the districts and some of the other standards that goes with it. So what comprises section 4, the uses you can see on there, and that's everything from our use tables to those use definitions, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second. Also gets into our accessory uses and structures, temporary uses, home occupations, and of course outdoor display and storage. Now, one of the things that we did is we looked at your current code and we said, okay, you know, there's a lot of outdated uses, or there's not enough uses. To go back to Mr. Irwood's concern, and yours as well, Mayor, we need some more flexibility. We need to create some additional uses and opportunities to do that. And also, how do we do that? All of that has been embedded in this particular section here. When we start talking about the use definitions and those standards, what we identified as part of one of our previous workshops, as well as early on in this process, was let's provide some information that says, okay, if this is a drive-through or if it's a bank, these are the things that we are assuming are going to be part of that bank. It's not an exhaustive list, but it also says, okay, if you have these extra features and it's, we'll say, adjacent to residential, then there's some additional considerations that you have to have. Excuse me. So there again, what we did is, that was not in your previous code. It is being recommended by us based off of some best planning practices and just from an ease of use. Because there again, what we're trying to do is for the general user, when they see a specific type of use, it is, not only looking to go, okay, it's a residential use and it's townhouse or something like that. Then instead of leaving it up to just being arbitrary to where, I've got 7 individual plus 3 staff all sitting there telling me 10 different things on the definition, we've given some criteria and some characteristics, and that will also help staff, especially from an administrative review component. So there again, what we did was we started off with those use groups, the residential and then the non-residential, broke them out by that. This follows the same pattern that we have with the districts themselves. And then the portion of that you see on the right-hand side of your screen, that's that use definition. So in this case, bank and financial institution, there are, what are the characteristics? And this is the same format that we have for all of these. What are the accessory uses? Previous codes, it would say, this is defined as an accessory use, and you'd have to look in 4 different places again. So we just said, okay, let's say what is a typical accessory use for this type of establishment? What are the examples that go within that? So if we're saying bank and financial, Mayor, I know this is right up your alley, it is, bank, financial institution, credit unions, and similar financial establishments. That last key right there is your get out of jail free card, because it allows you the flexibility if somebody comes up with something that staff can look at and say, hey, that's actually pretty close because it's similar in meeting these criteria. Keep moving forward. And then there again, are there some additional standards that we want to try to protect where, maybe adjacent to a residential neighborhood? Do you want the call boxes or the drive-through areas being right up against the house? So that's where we're saying, that doesn't apply in every case. It's just where you have certain scenarios and situations. So there again, just making sure that there are some items that are identified, not only in the use table, but also the use definitions. Keeping in mind that this is completely, totally separate from your formal definitions, which is Section 8. And that's where we define alleys and right-of-ways and other types of, I'll say, your more formalized components. So what does it look like at the end of the day? So this is just a screen clip from Section 4.2. And what we did is, each use group has its own set of tables. And that's the reason some of this actually starts to get a little lengthy. So you have the use group. In this case, it's a residential group. You can see the components that have been provided there. Second column in are those use definitions. That's telling you right there where to go in the next portion of this to go, okay, if I want to know about group living, I need to go to 431G. Boom, I'm not looking. And then from the broader use groups, the residential, the non-res, I apologize. There again, is it a permitted use? Is it a special exception, or is it not permitted? The X is pretty simple. What we did early on was, some people will say, well, just leave it blank. We've had legal opinions that say if it's blank, then we're not sure. Put the X in, or put an in, or put something that says no. So it's very clear to us as a body what we're reviewing and why. Excuse me. Same thing with the accessory uses, and we did discuss this at length with council previously, setting up the same table, including those definitions so that there again, it's very clear what we're identifying as accessory under this scenario and what are the standards that go along with that. We heard loud and clear the use of materials, the building heights, the sizes and the placement of those. Those have all been reflected in the proposed UDO standards themselves. I hate to ask staff for a bottle of water. I'm starting to get that little bit of a thing in my back of my throat. So before we move into the design and development standards, are there any questions or thoughts on Section 4 with the use tables, the districts, and some of the items that have been defined?
Just,
Go ahead.
just a comment about, and I picked up several things that, where you mentioned that the attorney said, well, if you leave it blank, then it's just open. we need to make sure there's not, there is in something it says that the color is to be used sparingly. That's not a good word. Just things like that. But that's,
Yeah, and actually, I'm gonna go back on one quick thing. If you look on page 86 of the proposed UDO, and the reason I want to point this out, because we talked about flexibility earlier, use is not listed. And I always go back to the example of 5-6 years ago, who had ever heard of pickleball? 10 years ago, who had ever used the term logistics in a warehouse distribution setting? Or it was, hey, it's a warehouse with a trucking facility. We realize things are going to change, new technologies, new uses, new approaches. So there again, we don't have a crystal ball, so we've given staff and this council the ability under that one thing that says use is not included, working with staff to look at the criteria for that to see what is the closest approximate type of use.
what page is that on?
On mine is page 86. It may be, it's right before you get into, it's second page of section 4, Mr. Arrowood. My page numbers may be different from,
Yeah, it's 85.
okay. My apologies. Yeah, subsection E. And there again, it's providing some criteria, not down to the finite level, that staff and this body have the ability to make those interpretations and keep moving forward.
I think that's going to be critical. One of the things that we've already had some discussion with staff about, and I know Ruthie stepped out, but from a commercial standpoint, the rapidly changing commercial landscape in terms of how their business models. So you've got businesses now that have one line that is the drive-through where you order, and you have another line for where you've ordered online. So you've got two separate drive-through lines. Or you've now got the restaurants that have the outdoor locker things where you go and punch your number in and you get your order and that kind of thing. And so one of the change that I think Ruthie's already working with in some regard, that now is going to triple the size of their outdoor freezer lockers because they're only going to do deliveries once every 3 weeks instead of twice a week or something. So I think one of the things that we'll have to, and I'm just looking through drive-through facilities here, right now there's a fairly limited number of places that you could do those. And there may be appropriate uses for that that would fit in some of these other models, and maybe even in some of the the residential models where where we've got somebody that wants to do a coffee shop of some kind where you can drive through and grab a coffee that's that's in a more traditional neighborhood area. So I think that's where we are going to have some flexibility and recognize that just like your example, I mean, whose police department had a cybercrime unit 30 years ago? I mean, we've got to be aware of the changing models.
Well, and I'm glad that you brought. And I'm glad you brought up the coffee shop, because I'm going to give you a great example of one that we're actually working with another community to fix. The code prohibited redevelopment by right. And basically, even if you were using an existing structure and not changing anything other than the interior, you still had to come under all the provisions, all the buffers, and all of the parking and all of that. One specific project in this community, I'm not going to name it, required 9 variances in order for an existing house on an existing lot in a commercial district to convert to a coffee shop. It was in the middle of commercial, and because there were already quote-unquote setbacks and other things, that is one of the prime examples of what we don't do in this code, nor shall we ever do in this code. And Mayor, looking at the drive-through components, We actually have a specific section there with the, I'll call it the call boxes versus the pickup and delivery windows. Now, I'm not going to name the name of a specific restaurant that's not open on Sundays, but you can't code to that level for all the drive-throughs. It's almost impossible. If you get really bored, I can show you one that's got a triple drive-through, including a little conveyor belt that goes over and drops stuff in. Yeah, it's kind of scary to see all that, but yeah.
And I heard a story today where that chain is being forced to go to nothing but drive-through by the town. And the reason, it was a valid reason, and that chain was willing to do it because of the circumstances of where they were located.
Yeah, and I'm going to give you another great example of making sure that what we've done here, and we're going to actually get into that with some of this in the next section with 5, is COVID. Heaven help you if you have, who here has not had COVID?
Way to go, Rick.
Yeah, okay.
Way to go, Jim.
I made it 3 years.
Some of your blood.
We'll do our best to make sure you can be part of the group.
Unrelated comment that this will actually get you, hopefully get a little chuckle. So coming in, I'm sitting beside a woman this morning, and I start my cough because I'm at the end of one of my cough drops. And she does that and looks, so I did. I have asthma, don't worry about it. And she goes, oh, okay. And she scoots back over. I'm like, I didn't like her that much anyway. Maybe I should have just, anyway, no. But, COVID changed a lot of things. When you start looking at the definition of loading and unloading zones in parking areas, the traditional is, we'll say, for the trucks. Now, when you have the pull up into your big box or some of your other restaurants and other grocery stores, you pull into a spot, you text, you stay in your car, they bring it out to you, you've loaded and unloaded. Have you technically created an inconsistency in your code? I've got to go back and relook at a couple of things that we may have done in that case, but you have to start taking those types of things into consideration. COVID changed a lot of things that we do from a standard practice, period. The days of the large big box have been shrinking. The days of more and more of these pull in, they bring it out to your car, you keep going, are taking over. It's a funny story, but I actually asked my wife, when's the last time that you actually went into Walmart? And she goes, just to it? And I said, no, physically got out of your car and went in. And she goes, I can't remember, because it's all online. Same type of thing that we're starting to see from a parking perspective. You'll hear, oh, we've got the Ubers, the Lyfts, and a lot of these other things, and we're going to have autonomous vehicles, so we don't need parking anymore. Well, question. Where do those cars go that the people are using? Do they go to loading and unloading zones, drop-off points, or is there still some parking lot at some point? So those are the kind of things that, it's always going on in our brain, but it's difficult to code for some of this at this point. So let's dive into, if we can, the design and development standards. So this is the other, I'll call it the big ticket item, because under this is where we're starting to say how we are measuring height. What about signs, landscaping and buffering, parking, access and circulation, all the way through those core components. Now, I know these are some of the topics that usually elicit the most comments. Why? Because we're now talking about signage. Now, you're going to hear me quote a lot of times the Reed case. And I know we've talked about this and you all are well aware of it, and this is something that the attorney will definitely be looking at. But, we can't regulate the type of sign. Oh, it's a daycare, so they can do this, versus, well, it's an office. You can't do that. That basically is a content-based decision that's made. You can say what type of sign, as far as is it freestanding, you can say the height, you can say the size of it, you can say the location, but you can't differentiate between religious institutions, banks, daycares, or whatever else at that point, because it's content-based, and the Supreme Court said you cannot do that anymore. When that case came out, and I know your staff, we've talked about this too, everybody began to scurry going, okay, what do we need to change? So what we've tried to do is to make sure that, based off of our interpretation and our working with codes and others, various municipal attorneys, that we've addressed it based off of those standards. Now, this is something that when I say I've had, 5 or 6 different municipalities and municipal attorneys come back with 5 different opinions, we're going to probably have a little different opinion from your city attorney. So we want to make sure we're looking at that. One of the things we also wanted to do, and we're going to do a deep dive in on how we were measuring some of this, the signage, the buffering, the open space parking and lighting. This is starting to also say, well, okay, we've got a building, we've got a site, how are we actually measuring it? When we talk about some of this, I think I made the comment during our initial interview that, a picture's worth 1,000 words, or in this case, it's 152 words, and I've got an example that actually took something that was almost half a page of code, and we reduced it down to 152 words in an image, and it showed everything from building setbacks, heights, access, pedestrian areas, and all of that. And it was all defined and illustrated on that. So instead of saying, well, we have to have a building step back above a certain elevation and or how do we define some of these building heights? We said, okay, we're going to start using a lot more graphics, because there again, everybody can look at that and go, okay, I see what you're talking about with, defines the habitable and the non-habitable space. And Mr. Airwood, this goes to one of your comments as far as what are we talking about if there is that rooftop bar or something else? Is that in the habitable space? Well, you have to start looking at how's the building designed, and we've tried to accommodate that. And where are the setbacks as it relates to a specific lot? How do we calculate something as simple as floor area ratio? You'd be surprised at how many people start to get into a debate about floor area ratio, especially from a code perspective. So we do something like that, and everybody goes, oh, okay, now I understand what we're talking about. To some of us that do this every day, it's no-brainer. You'll usually hear us say FAR, FAR, or something like that, and a lot of people go far from what? No, floor area ratio. So there again, trying to make sure that as we are defining some of these standards, whether it is building height or some of our facade standards, what does that actually look like from a code perspective? Signage. So this is one of those things there again that we've tried to, and I know we did expand what was in the code, and you may start to say, well, why did you do that? What we're trying to do is to provide enough information so staff can make a determination and or identification based off of the code. Does it meet certain standards from a location, the site design, defining specific types of signs? What do we are requiring from a landscaping perspective, all the way through to what are prohibited and some of those exempt signs. There again, in working with municipal attorneys, they've told us we need to make sure that we have been very clear in these areas and that we're not being arbitrary. So there again, city attorney may come back and go, hey guys, you don't need this, this, or this, or I prefer this language. We will defer and default to the city attorney. Why? He's the one that is responsible at the end of the day to defend you all. So,
General question on
yes, sir.
signs.
Perfect opportunity so I can get a drink.
There are a lot of restrictions on signage. Things, you can't have anything that rotates, you can't, no neon, anything like that.
Excuse me.
I'm contagious now, sorry.
Yeah, I'm good.
I mean, are we want to have a lot of bland signage that just, but then that's not, what are we trying to achieve? And then you go back to the downtown district. The old, started out with the old Bank of Greer, which is at Victoria and Trade. You look at pictures of it, it had a sign mounted to the corner and it was block letters all the way down and it looked great. You see a lot
in towns, and I know we had a couple of jewelers here, I don't know if they had this kind of sign, but they would have their sign, and then under it maybe a clock, a lot of times it would rotate. And then you would have, out on the highway, and I know this, you don't have to have one as high, but Phillips 66 had the ball that would rotate. And Phillips 66 is actually coming back, and there's one in Travelers Rest now. So is there a way that we can, besides saying a hard no, I mean, you exclude neon, and a lot of neon is considered artwork.
So neon is only currently not allowed in our downtown overlay. So it will only not be allowed in that small little historic district, and it will be allowed everywhere else. So just rotating, that's kind of up to you guys. I think if it were going to be appropriate, it would probably be, regional center, mixed use, one of our heavy commercials like Wade Hampton. But that's up to you. If you want it, we'll do it. We just.
And why is your feeling you wouldn't do it in downtown?
It's a slippery slope. I don't know. I mean, I believe there was an establishment that wanted a very large rotating dessert treat that had a lot of issues, and people did not want it. So
Well,
I don't know.
the rotating part can be limited by size,
Sure.
but they're, I mean.
Not Abbott's.
If our intent is to keep things looking like 1930s, well, then let's do that.
Okay.
I mean,
Do we-
that's my opinion, because.
What do you guys think?
Well, it's hard to have it both ways. I mean, we go from, we define it in here from 1895 to 1930, and then we get on to
Oh, yeah.
specific design, types of designs as architects call them. And, and in downtown, there was all kinds of things, 1895. So, I mean,
I don't have a response. I have let's hear it. We'll change it. I don't.
Well, there's a lot of things maybe 95 we don't want, we don't want to go back to wooden sidewalks.
Put the hitching posts up.
And hitching posts.
well, hey, I got that, but what I'm saying is if we call it a historic district, and so we want to pick and choose, is that what we're doing? We're picking and choosing things that are pleasing to us? Or are we saying that these are the designs, this is what was used, so this is what we want to do? That's why I keep asking, what are we trying to achieve? Because
I think what we're trying to achieve is the historical context of downtown, which is not necessarily the signage as much as it is the facades and the building and the street and that sort of thing, because,
well,
I
would disagree.
I don't know that we want to go back to, the neon signs across the front of the buildings that may have been popular in the 20s or whenever it was that they were popular. Across downtown, I mean, I personally don't think that.
Well, and then here's another example. We talk about awnings. And we can have cloth awnings, is that correct? In downtown? I think that's one of the.
Yes.
So are they retractable, or are they fixed, or, because during that era, they
were metal.
They were metal, and then you also had the retractable, the roll-in kind that came up at night. So, I mean, how accurate do we want to be? And I know it's getting us down a rabbit hole, so.
Yeah, well, and it is tough. I mean, if you had one sign, Phillips 66 with a ball, it's like interesting. The problem is you can't then prohibit 20 in a row having moving and the distraction, and it's just a slippery slope. So I mean, it's up to you guys how far you want to go, and we're open to legislating based on that. So
When you say distracting, I mean, if,
as you're driving by,
sure, and and is it distracting because it's appealing and people are looking at it? Or is it, oh my gosh, that's just too big, it's too gaudy, we can legislate size.
Well, Mr. Airwood, to be honest with you, most people are looking at their phones when they drive by anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I said most people are looking at their phones anyway when they drive past these things, so it's not really that big of an issue. But in all seriousness, the issue of distraction and distracting signage really does become kind of a sticky wicket, so to speak. But we'll take a look at this particular matter too, and try and.
Just look at some of the historical, even Highway 29 back in the 30s. And look, and then beyond, and look at just some of the gas stations. And they didn't have signs that were 200 feet tall. They were maybe 20 feet, whatever. And I don't know, but I think maybe we should look at that, not just out and out say no.
Yeah, I don't think you can limit yourself historically too much, because you may have somebody come to you. I remember when downtown was nothing but neon signs almost. Most of the major businesses, there were a bunch of, not just the sign from the bank sticking out, but the jewelers and the dime stores. They all had, it was the thing. It was a big deal. And I think if somebody brings you a design where it enhances what they want to do to that building, and I know this crosses a line between what looks good and what doesn't look good. I just don't think you can limit yourself. If they want to put up a Phillips 66 station on 29, that ball will work well there. If you want to put it down here where the hot spot is, and maybe not so much, I think you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. I really do.
So just to kind of echo something that Ashley said is, one, you could have the rotating Phillips sign and limit it to certain areas, exactly like you were just saying. And it's appropriate here, but it's not appropriate here. More importantly is, as soon as Phillips or Krispy Kreme or anybody else says, we want that same sign, she's got to approve it.
Put it right out there on 29 where the Phillips 66 is.
Yeah.
And we'll line them up.
One of the things I always get in debates with, including some of my old partners, because they're like, oh, well, there's not enough signage in your codes. There's not enough signage on the buildings. And I'm like, you're going to sit there and tell me that a big box user who shall remain nameless, nobody knows where that is?
Yeah. Well,
Or in the case like Mr. Mayor, they're on their phone going, oh, I got to turn here. Yeah. But that's my little soapbox. So there again, we can code to whatever standards you want. The one thing we can't say is it could be Phillips with a gas station, but it can't be a bank having the same types of sign if it's in the same district.
Sure, I
Yeah.
understand that, but part of that signage is not just saying, oh, this is Bettis Jewelers. But you, on that rotating clock on the bottom, it's Bullwood.
Yeah.
He is a Bullwood dealer, so you
Yeah.
know that. It's like a hardware sign, Devo Paint. And I believe and one of the signs it's missed now, and I think it would be non-conforming, was the Bullett's Barbershop sign that somebody came in the night and stole. And it was the old, was it Pepsi-Cola sign? And, it was a high-value sign, but I think it was non-conforming. So, that was part of the history. I mean, Bullett's Barbershop, that's a historical place. Lots of deals and lots of stories told there. But
so do we have like a quick hand raise consensus that you'd like us to relook at signs and maybe be a little more flexible? Or are we?
I'm very flexible about signage. That's kind of what got me started in city government, period.
Okay.
And I even think that you should consider the width of the road from curb to curb when you get talking about what you allow as far as signage.
I will say it's really tough on staff. Right now, our signage is based on speed limit of the road, which is sort of along those same lines. You know, if they're low speed, they tend to be narrower. It's an enforcement nightmare. People are like, well, what's my speed limit? And I'm like, well, I don't know. You go out there and tell me, or I go to Google Earth and try and find the speed limit. It's tough for staff, and it's also tough for someone coming in, scouting the area, like, to tell what we're really allowed to do. So I mean, best practice wise, doing it per zoning district, I think is a good change. But again, we're here to serve y'all, so we're open to it.
So there again, you know, as we're defining some of these signs, and like Ashley said, you know, if you're flipping between that image right there with the matrix and those types of images, we can 100% code to what you're asking about, especially on Wade Hampton, and making sure that, you know, if you are along Wade Hampton or whatever else, and you've got a pole or pylon, you know, that we've identified that here, not only in the type of sign and defining it, but also the specific characteristics within that corridor or within those zoning districts specifically.
If I may make a suggestion, since this is really the first stab at the whole working document, can we just marinate on the signage issue for a while and then just discuss it the next time we come together? Because this is the deep dive part of it, as Ashley's writing up there, is important, and clearly there's a differing number of opinions. So we'll take a look at it, see what kind of hard recommendations that we can make that are specific to flexibility, and then we can discuss that the next time we're together.
That's always how the sign argument ends up.
The flexibility. Yeah.
Is it helpful to staff if we found photographs of different signs, whether they existed here in town or existed on a highway? Because that's what we're trying to do. I go back to form-based zoning. No matter what the occupant of the building is doing, it's got to look like this on the outside. Now that is probably not anything that's accepted now, but that's what I see us trying to do, is define a look. And if we have flexibility, you've got to say, well, it's going to look like this, like you've done a lot of, which is great. So, I mean, would that be helpful?
Absolutely. You know, one of the best things that I will tell you, and it drives my wife crazy, is we go on vacation, and I'm snapping photos of buildings and signs and buffers, and she actually made this joke once because we were at Hilton Head. She goes, "Did you take any pictures of the kids?" So, but no, those kinds of things, because that tells us very clearly, and it articulates exactly what you're thinking. I like this, and this is, you know, why? Don't just say, I like this sign. Well, what do you like about the sign? Is it the shape of it, the height of it, the way it's structured, or what at that point?
Do we have anything in there about painting the sides of buildings with pictures?
We do have language in there regarding murals and some of the walls. So that was one of the things that we've been working closely with staff on since pretty much the first version of some of our sections.
How are we handling multi-tenant units, like let's say, because everybody's wanting shared office space, it's so expensive. How are we handling the sign situation there?
So we do break it out if it's a single standalone versus a multi-tenant. There are specific standards, and if you give me just a second. Famous last words.
think we do require joint ID signs for anything over 2, but that's for freestanding. Do you mean on a building or like the number of signs like along the road? Or either?
Just in general, yeah.
Okay.
I just want to make sure we're at least looking at it.
Yeah, we definitely have a joint identification sign for freestanding, but I believe we do also allow, right now we do allow in a strip center each tenant space to have their own, although I will say the current downtown overlay where the big red area is not great with that, and that is something that will be addressed. Because like right now, the smoothie place and the ear piercing place, they wanted 2 signs, and because they only had 1 entrance, they weren't allowed to have 2, so one is projecting on the side and one's on the side, and honestly it looks awkward, so it was a code fail. So that is something we definitely did look at, especially in the overlay, because the downtown is tough. It's not great for multi-tenants that don't have parcel lines.
Were you asking about?
Did I misunderstand? Sorry.
We did, I don't know, I want to see if this is what Mr. Cook was asking about. We did a job on extension where we took an existing office building that was built, set up for doctor use, medical use, and we changed it to an environment where businesses could come in and lease certain space. within-
Those are tough. We have many of those now, actually, and it is really tough.
That's what I was
So
asking.
that would be helpful to have some guidance from you guys. Right now, they would really only be allowed, 1 side on each facade, but we do draw boxes around. So if they have, 4 squares with different businesses, if you draw a box around it and it fits, that's okay. But I don't know when there's like 20 or 30. That's an interesting question.
An example that I know of, and it's not 20 or 30, but Mark Thornton passed away recently, but at his office building,
Okay.
it's what is it when you have 2 brick columns coming up and the sign in the middle of that? Is that a
Monument sign.
what?
Monument
It
sign.
depends. It's either a post or
Well,
monument, but
anyway,
yeah.
it's got-
Mhm.
It had T-square design and
Yep.
construction, and then he leased space inside his building, and under that, there was smaller strips.
Yes. And that would be allowed as long as the big square did not exceed a certain amount. Yep.
So if I could come back to your comment, because there's a couple of different things. Actually, I'm going to do 2 things. One,
Should we pull it up?
oh,
Do you want me to? We can escape and.
yeah, if you want to, Ashley. While she's doing that, not only did we change how the city can measure signs to be a little bit more flexible, because like Ashley said, you had to draw the box around and that's how you got it. Because of the size and shape and the unique features of a lot of signs, we said, okay, here's how you start to calculate all of these areas. There again, trying to be a little bit more flexible. And to your question and comment, we actually have provisions in the proposed UDO. I think it's on like 152 or 153. And it is the number of signs, and it's based off of the tenant or the business. And it's not based off of a specific, we'll say, 1 building and they get 1 sign, even though they may have 4 tenants. There are provisions in here for those types of co-working facilities or multi-tenant facilities. Now, there's a limitation on how many signs that each of those businesses can have, but there is, if this was 1 building, we have 7 individuals, and each of those boxes is that lease area, you could actually have, each of you could have your own sign.
I think it was up.
It was up.
This one sort of shows it where there's multiple tenants on a monument, but it's really a joint identification sign.
Yeah, so we've got the wall signs and some of the other, we don't actually do a multi-tenant on the wall to show the example, other than, that one, and then right before that is.
is the square around? Or no? That's roads.
The multi-tenant components is right there.
Okay.
And then how we calculate is just in front.
Okay, so the short answer is yes, but if you have concerns with it, let us know
Yeah, I
and we'll
guess
take
the
another
question
look.
is, the concern is, how do you just keep, because you see folks put the yard signs out, and then we go in, we take them. Well, how do we give them some way of, okay, well, you can't do this, but this is what you can do.
Yeah.
So just making sure we're at least covering that now that we have a chance to talk about, it.
Yeah, I think one example on East Poinsett is, I think Ally. They're leasing out a lot of their internal space, but they put a big monument sign out that was just for them. They could have put, Ally and then had smaller squares underneath, or they could add on top. They don't tend to want to spend that extra money. We'll certainly look at that and make sure it is addressed well. Maybe we'll run a couple examples through, especially some of the co-working spaces, and see if it allows enough.
Yeah.
We'll do some beta.
All right, council, we're sort of at an inflection point here. We're at 8 o'clock. We've got an executive session yet to go after that, which I don't think is going to take a long time. Can you all wrap up in 30 minutes?
We can do as much or as little as you want me to, Mayor. Let's put it that way.
Get where we get.
Yeah, we get where we get.
Council, we're going to try and minimize our feedback except for when it's asked for or needed. If you've got just a burning question, go ahead and throw it out. But I'm going to give you all the floor for another 30 minutes, and then we'll see where we go from there. How about that?
Okay. So there again, what we've identified there is just those graphics and some of those sign standards. So Ashley's taken some very good notes for us. Buffering is a brand new kind of approach that we've identified. So what we've come up with are 4 buffering types. We've seen some places that do 2, we've seen some places that do 8, and variations thereof. Our thought is keep it simple. Start looking at what are some of those appropriate widths based off of what we've seen and what we understand is important to the city, or, looking at some of those types of things. So we identified in the graphic that you see here 4 different types of buffer standards, and those are district to district. It's not use to use. It's not, it's not all within the commercial general, and then you've got different buffer standards for, we'll say, a restaurant versus cars. But it is where you have the commercial general next to residential. So what we did is start to identify in this chart what are those items that, one, are the widths, as well as the number of trees, as well as berms and walls and things like that. And then from that standpoint, we started creating the graphics to say, if you're going to do a type 1, this is generally what it looks like, both looking at it from the front, the top, and the side. This is critical, especially when you start looking at the one from the side, because what we found out, a lot of places will say, well, you can have a wall, but you also have to have this amount of landscaping. But they never define where that wall goes. So the first thing that happens, especially in a residential community, is the wall goes on the outside, closest to the road, and all the trees go inside, so the residents are looking at trees. We've clarified that you can still do trees internal, but you need to have the trees on the outside to help, because that's what the buffer is there for. It's to buffer from the adjacent uses looking into that property, not from the people living there looking out onto something else. So there again, we did the 4 standards, just kind of providing those components so everybody could see visually. And one of the things that we also have identified in there is we also realize that every site is not the same. Topography, utility, drainage easements, roads, things like that. So there are provisions that allow for the clumping or the clustering of trees to allow for some unique designs, allowing for kind of the meandering trees and shrubs instead of having that row of 10 soldiers. That's the last thing we want to see. But, so we have made provisions that somebody can come in, especially if they're creative, within that area and either cluster them because of a natural feature or just a cluster from an aesthetic standpoint. This is the chart that I was telling you about. So, where we have an RS up against an RS, some places have said, well, we don't care if it's residential up against residential. Other places have said, we don't care if it's residential, you're still providing us a buffer of some sort. That is another one of those 100% up to this body. The other thing that you'll see is start to look through the buffering standards, and what I would encourage you to do is to pull that out of your notebook, look at this standard, look at the chart that I showed you, and then look at the types and go, okay, where we have commercial right now up against residential, that would, require, in essence, a type 3 buffer. That type 3 buffer is 25-foot width with the 4 trees per 100 feet, and you kind of go through the line at that point. Is that sufficient? There again, you all could say, we don't care, we just want 10 feet around everything. Or you could say, well, actually, we'd like to see something a little bit more robust. And what we've tried to do is to save I'll call it the bigger or the more intensive type of buffer, which is our type 4. And that's where we have some of our bigger uses. So the industrial next to the residential, or industrial, or some of our technology components adjacent to the residential. Because we're ultimately still going to have some of those heavy industrial types of districts being developed next to an adjacent residential neighborhood. You're never going to be able to exclude that. So the other thing we start to say is this the right buffer in the right application? So I'm going to stop there for just a second and see if we can get some head nods or some questions. And it's a stall tactic, so I can get some water.
Council?
I don't have a question about the buffers at this point, but I really haven't gotten into it. But I think this might be where I started to see it, was the signage, landscaping, that kind of thing, irrigation. And all irrigation, we're requiring rain sensors, so that the system does not activate while it's raining. Why are we requiring that expense for property owners?
So that has been pretty, I'll say, more of an industry standard, so that, especially if you're using gray water, it's not a big deal. If you're using potable water, then you start looking at what is that impact on the city's, or the water supply.
But, well, this would have to be something the council I would want to delete that, because any water that we save goes on down the river. Because we don't have, our water system is drawn from 2 lakes. And CPW is going to take in and clean the water necessary to supply their customers. And whatever else is not used, either by no demand or by conservation, it goes on down the river, and all we have done is cost somebody extra dollars to put those sensors on there, which they'll work. They won't work. So that's something I see that it's not applicable around here. Now, maybe it's an industry standard, and the industry is the sprinkler industry, because they want to sell more parts. But, I understand why you use that stuff, but I think that should be the choice, not a demand.
So the one thing I will say is, looking at, it's not the sprinkler industry pushing that. Of course, we're utilized, I think you remember Kyle Ball, who did part of your downtown master plan. So registered landscape architects and arborists looking at what's the best for the health of the plants. So that's the other aspect. It's not only the water conservation, it's also for an ongoing maintenance and the health of the plant. The other aspect of that is when you start looking at the overall cost of a site, and I know a cost is a cost is a cost, but the cost of something like that is minimal when you start looking at what is the overall cost for installing the landscaping or doing the parking lots or buildings.
Yeah, but we're not, if we do landscaping, the city, and we decide to put those sensors on our systems, I would say that's in an effort to, one, save dollars for our citizens, because they're paying for the water usage. But when company ABC builds and they put in a irrigation system, it should be their choice to put in the sprinkler system and what accessories that go with it, how much water they use. I mean, we say you've got to keep the landscaping alive. So what's the next step? We're going to tell residents you've got to water your lawn so it stays green until we say it's too dry and you can't use water. That I think, that kind of crosses the line on that. But, and then the other thing,
I
and
think
I'm
there's a
not asking a question.
Yeah.
I'm not asking for any answers. The other thing, I should have mentioned it when we talk about parking. Some of the parking could be designated for electric vehicles charging stations. That's well and fine. But should we also put not a caveat, but another line in there, or other types of fuel? Because, tomorrow's flavor may not be electrical. It might be hydrogen, or it could be compressed natural gas. So is there any particular reason is it just because today's flavor is EVs?
So I can answer that one. So one of the, and yeah, I was going to say the EV component is a big item. It's also something that's being pushed by the Federal Highway Administration. There's also dollars that have been provided by Washington down to the state level for statewide EV plans. We specifically didn't get into the phase 1, phase 2, or types of things like that because of the changing technology that's out there for EV. The thing that we're seeing in some of our best practices and some of our industry experts is, the EV standards are here to stay. The hydrogen and the compressed natural gas and some other things, not so much at this point, just because of some of the costs associated with it.
And that's changed very recently. There's manufacturers now that are building vehicles with internal combustion motor that uses hydrogen. You got Toyota, the president of Toyota just said, yeah, well, I'm not on board with all of this EV stuff because we don't know. And so Nissan has done the same. And I'm not saying that we should not have that in there, regardless of what kind of highway standard. But why don't we add other fuel sources? That's something I'm going to throw out there.
Because the infrastructure for the EVs is electrical, which is going to be going in most of the buildings anyway. I don't know that Walmart's going to have a hydrogen station out or a compressed gas place out in front. That would be more of a separate kind of thing.
No, not necessarily, because see, and that's the thing, and I'm not arguing one technology over another. I'm just saying that some of the stuff, for instance, it's very easy. That's what the president of Toyota said, to put in an infrastructure for hydrogen or compressed natural gas, because all of that stuff is there. It's a matter of running a line or putting in a tank. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying, why don't we have that ability to say, okay, well, we're going to allow this for electric. Why not other fuel sources?
Yeah, I think we can add some flexibility language to allow for other. It would also potentially be one of those, use not listed and a staff interpretation that it is similar to EV and therefore allowed. I mean, but certainly we can add that language to be a little more flexible.
Okay.
Also, I fully expect this to be a living document, and as things change, well, for one, the first 2 years, you should expect us quarterly or every 6 months. As we put this into place, we're going to be bringing amendments forward. But as the industry changes, as brick and mortar commercial changes, absolutely. We want to be able to be nimble and make some changes, so.
Good point. There's two pieces of legislation in front of our legislators right now that would affect this very document. I mean, short use rentals and, donut holes.
Sure.
You know, if either
But I
one of
think
those
that's a great
pass,
point. We're
you know,
happy to-
If either one of those pass, we've got to go back to the drawing board in some regards. So, I mean, we're gonna be making changes. Council, I'm gonna give them 20 more minutes at this point, since we've gotten a little off track here, to go ahead and finish up. I'm gonna ask that we minimize any discussion at this point, and let them try and get on through here, because we're gonna have plenty to consider at this point.
Mayor, with your approval and the council's approval, if we could, we'll get through section 5, no problem.
Okay?
Like I said, we've only got a couple more sections to talk about specific to that. And at the end of 5, I'll let you make the call at that point, whether we keep going or not, if that's okay with you.
That's fine, let's go.
So, okay, open spaces. It's another one of those of how do we define those open spaces that we want for residential and non-residential development as they're coming through. Does not affect redevelopment, does not affect components like in the downtown area. The new neighborhoods that are coming in, you know, we did look at your DRDs. We sat down, we went through a lot of different applications, and then started saying, okay, what are the types of open spaces and amenities and facilities are we getting versus what would we like? One of the things that we start to see from it's a challenging perspective is a lot of codes say, well, we want open space, and they never define what is defined as open space. So we start getting the utility easements, which is not a bad thing, or we get the stormwater ponds. And stormwater is running 18 to 20% in a lot of cases of a particular property's development. And that's quote unquote open space that is not usable by anybody other than the stormwater runoff. So one of the things that we started looking at was, okay, if we're going to be doing certain types of new projects, whether it's like a PUD or some of our old DRDs, we want to make sure we've got some of those facilities that are there for the residents to enjoy. And that comes in the form of these, what you see right here, whether it's a pocket park or amenity center, greens. And we've kept this very fluid and very flexible in the fact that somebody could come in and go, hey, we would like to do a green, and we define what a green is. We say, well, in that plus an amenity center, you can get to these standards very, very easily. None of the applications that were reviewed from a DRD perspective would not meet the standards that we're proposing here. But what we're doing is, instead of saying, okay, staff, you're doing this, going, I don't know, now we've codified what staff has been looking at and what this council's been looking at. So there again, we start looking at the standards that you see, including those graphics, and at the same time, you know, it is required based off of its residential versus non-residential versus mixed use, and, you know, trying to create some of those spaces that, usable spaces, including what we're saying, which is an active use area, which is a lot of what you have right now along your sidewalk areas, those sidewalk seating areas. Those kinds of things should be counted as part of your open space in those settings. So we're not trying to penalize, we're just trying to kind of put into play what you're already asking for. But there again, make it a certainty that there's a standard that says we are going to require this, and here's what you can do. There again, it's very flexible in the amount of acre, depending on the size of the property, the number of facilities, and it's a buffet. You know, if we say, oh, you've got to have 2 of these types of features, there are 7 types of features that you can choose from. The one thing we did not want to do is to say, and this is a community we actually worked in to fix, every residential neighborhood shall have a tot lot. That's great, but what if it's a senior living community? I'm not seeing too many 55 and older folks going down a circular plastic slide. So that's where we try to start to say it needs to be context sensitive. We want to have those options because you as the developer, you as the property owner, know what you're trying to market to. I'm not going to sit here and try to dictate that you shall have a swimming pool or you shall have a swing set. You know what your marketing is and what you're trying to attract. There again.
Speaking of that, the marketing by the landowner or the developer, and I could be wrong, but I did glance over that, and it looks like all of the open space is developed open space, more than just going in and clearing out and having a wooded environment. Is that correct?
No, sir.
Okay.
No, actually, no, we encourage those types of natural features. And we also do say that, because stormwater is a fact of life, but a lot of stormwater facilities can be amenitized by putting a walking trail, or even if it's a pier going out on top of that in some of those cases. Why not allow some of those areas to be counted towards your open space at that point?
Sure, but what, and I guess I just missed it, but, so the defined areas, so there is a defined area that is nothing, like if somebody it was a buffer, but it's also to be utilized as open space, and it's trees from the edge of the road inward, and they come in, and not just leave it, because I think that looks ragged, but if they come in and mulch it with a forestry mulcher, get it all cut down, make it where it looks, where people can get in there and just goof off, play around.
So part of that is also that we've also set up the standard to where it's not 100% can be in one of those categories. You still have some provisions that, those open space areas, if they put a mulch trail or, carve out a trail through some of that, that should be able to be used as part of your open space. Just the fact that they go in there and clear it, it's a lot and nothing's on it, that's the areas that we're like, that really doesn't count based off of what we're showing here. So there again.
No, it doesn't count, but you made the comment that, well, we're not telling you to have a swimming pool, we're not telling you to have a playground because you know what your folks want. And a developer says, these are what my folks want.
Mm-hmm.
So do we have that option or not? Is that if
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No. Do we have that option?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Item number 4, which is a linear parking greenway, specifically says may be designed around a natural feature such as a stream, wetland system, stormwater, other man-made or natural feature. And it goes on to talk about, it does require some walkways and some other things through there, but there is that option.
But that's a developed area. You're going in.
Minimized.
Yeah, but it's still a developed area that you're gonna put a sidewalk in, or you're gonna do this. I mean, what's wrong with leaving what is there?
So the one thing I will say is that there's a difference between, we'll call it the active and passive recreation components of the open space, and then just the open space components. So the areas that you're talking about, and I apologize, I'm catching on to what you're saying, Mr. Airwood, is let's say that, the area back here was nothing but trees. There's provisions that say that area counts as this form of open space, passive recreation or whatever else. Then there's this other standard that says, but we also want some active. Those provisions are in there. What we were just looking at was more of the active and I'll say the recreational components versus the open space preservation.
Right, and one of the things that was important to me about it being in here is that when you're using that passive space, that it wasn't just trees that are voluntary with a lot of undergrowth that was invasive undergrowth that really doesn't belong, that it would be, and that invasive species would be taken out and it would, you follow what I'm saying?
Yes, sir.
Is that, did y'all?
We did, and I need to go back and double check to make sure we did talk about the removal of the invasives, because that is a big deal.
Yeah.
Because, if you've got the invasives, the last thing you want is that taking over your,
It's identified in the landscaping section.
Okay.
We can move on.
thank you.
I have one question.
Yes, sir.
Is there a no open space requirement?
No.
A no
No.
open space? The only thing I wanted to add was, could we consider a no open space in the case of, let's say, you're within a mile of a park and it's all connected by a sidewalk?
So the other thing that you're looking at is, I mean, we've got, I'll say in a residential is a minimum of 10%, which is very, very minimal. Now, there again, if this body says, hey, we want that as an option, then yeah, absolutely. We've had other communities that have said, you know, if you're within a half a mile of an public park or whatever, no open space, no recreation space. You still have your open space provisions built in there to take care of what Mr. Arrow was talking about with the trees and things like that. Good comment, like that. Off-street parking, again, trying to be as flexible as possible, looking at industry standards, best planning practices, as well as some engineering, and also looking at projects that are being developed as we speak. So looking at not only your existing, but also looking at other communities. Similar to the way we laid out our use table, it's the same type of layout, the minimum and maximum. We identify how you're calculating those. The other thing that it has in there is, and it says users not limited. It should be users not listed, typo on my part. But more importantly, there is a provision that says, okay, you don't want to meet these standards or can't meet these standards. Here's the process. You can look at on-street parking, off-site parking. You can look at parking reductions. And you know, there's a series of things that are called out there to allow, because we don't know. Every multifamily project that we do comes in with something different, whether it's 1.2 parking spaces per unit up to 1.8. So, you know, give them, there again, that's the reason we did the range. The other thing is if they come in and say, we're, you know, right there on a transit stop, we can actually reduce our parking by, you know, 30% based off of the studies that we've done. You as the city and the staff have that ability. Lighting, this is usually one of the least controversial components that we talk about. But, you know, just looking at, starting to look at some of the overall design. I know the dark sky ordinance is a big deal and we try to incorporate those components. But what we've also said is, you know, maximum lighting structure as far as heights, internal, you know, maximum 30 feet. The further you go out away, so we'll say going from something on Wade Hampton that's further back, that, you know, the structures could be taller when you come out to Wade Hampton, then that they should actually be smaller and directed inward. One of the things we're trying to do is minimize light pollution at that point, because there's nothing worse than a parking lot light as you're driving. So that's the reason we start looking at some of those standards to try to, you know, push the lighting internal to the site, minimize the structure heights, and, you know, kind of there again, focus it onto the site itself. Mayor, and I will say that is the last of section 5 that we were going to present. So we can, I was going to say section 6. There's about 12 slides on section 6.
Yeah, we're gonna call it.
I was going to say, this is a perfect
I don't want to
stopping
completely
point.
wear your voice out, and I think we're probably at the point that we need to call it anyway, so.
Yeah.
You all have had a lot to think about in the last 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
And like the perfect stopping point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to again thank you. This was fantastic feedback. I think we got a lot of marching orders. I really look forward to the next session and moving forward. And just again, thank you guys so much for your time. And we will reach out soon about setting up office hours. But always feel free to email me questions or call or mark up copies and we'll go over them. I'm happy to, and I'm happy to set up time with the consultant as well.
All right. Council, we're gonna take about a 5-minute break here, and then we'll come back at executive session. How about that? In executive session, we have considered a contractual matter in regards to the purchase of a piece of property pertaining to Project Indy. Do I hear a motion to come out of
executive session. And a second.
Second.
Mr. Sell.
Mr. Booker,
Yeah.
Mr. Hopper,
Yes.
Mr. Bettis,
Yes.
Ms. Albert. Yes. Mayor Danner.
Yes. We are out of executive session. We're going to need a motion from someone to allow the administrator to enter into a negotiation for the purchase of a piece of property.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make a motion to empower the city administrator to enter into negotiations pertaining to a piece of property in regard to Project Indy.